The outbreak of war in August 1914 caught him off guard, as it did almost everyone else. He'd been a vocal opponent of war in the past, but the decision of Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany to invade Belgium, a small country, roughly the size of Wales, offended his sense of justice and aroused his patriotic zeal.
I remember talking to his daughter on this very thing, and she remembers being in 11 Downing Street and Lloyd George coming in and said, "Now they've invaded Belgium. My doubts are over. This means war."
Once he decided that this was a war that he was going to support, he threw himself into it with such extraordinary energy, right from the start. I mean, wherever you look, you see Lloyd George's fingerprints. It's as if he's cranking this machine all on his own, taking on the generals, taking on the munitions workers, running along here and there and everywhere.
Oh, in many ways, he was the man who won the war. Not so much perhaps as Prime Minister, but as Minister for Munitions. He threw himself into running the munitions industry. It was a completely new post. There had been a great shortage of ammunition and equipment. Lloyd George dealt with both.
In 1916, after serving as Minister of Munitions for just over a year, Lloyd George became Secretary of State for War. In 1916, after serving as Minister of Munitions for just over a year, Lloyd George became Secretary of State for War. This was the move which lifted his popularity to unprecedented heights. Just how popular he'd become was shown that August, when he visited the Welsh National Eisteddfod in Aberystwyth and was almost mobbed as he tried to get out of his car. Now, a politician with this level of public appeal was an obvious candidate for Prime Minister. And 4 months later, when Asquith's premiership ran into the ground, that's what happened. Lloyd George entered number 10 Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister on the 7th of December 1916. There'd been intense speculation about who would emerge, and even today historians disagree on the reasons why Lloyd George was finally chosen. But there is more agreement on one thing, which is that Lloyd George didn't get to Downing Street by plotting with other people to stab Asquith in the back. The idea that he'd been at the centre of some plot to undermine Asquith plagued Lloyd George for many years. But the truth is that Asquith had lost the confidence of Parliament and he had to go. It was a blow for him, but it was a shot in the arm for Britain, because Lloyd George's arrival at number 10 was, as everyone agrees, a turning point in the war.
It's very important, I think, in wartime, and I think it happened with Churchill as well, and it happened with Georges Clemenceau in France, that you need someone who can in some way inspire the nation and speak for them. And I think Lloyd George did that. He brought a mood of confidence, he brought hope that, yes, perhaps Britain would not just survive the war, but would win it.
He showed himself to be enormously more inspirational and energetic than Asquith had been. He was, I think, as important to the winning of the war as Churchill was in the Second World War, even though Lloyd George hadn't Churchill's experience of military matters.
I think probably his finest moment in the First World War was the days after the 21st of March 1918, when the Germans broke through, and it really did look very grim. And people who later did not like Lloyd George, who were close to him at that time, said he was very courageous, that he kept going, he wasn't downhearted, and that this kind of radiated out.
More popular by 1918 than ever before, despite the continuing trauma of war, Lloyd George was keen to continue his transformation of British society. His aim, encapsulated by him in a long-remembered phrase, was to create a fit country for heroes to live in. And that November, events seemed to leave him perfectly poised to do just that. At precisely 11 o'clock on the morning of the 11th, 1918, the First World War came to an end after 4.5 years of horrific slaughter. Earlier that morning, George had come to the House of Commons to tell Parliament that the armistice was about to be signed. And across Europe that day, if you'd asked people who'd done most to bring the war to an end, there's no doubt what the answer would have been. David Lloyd George. In the long run, the First World War would come to be seen, not least by Lloyd George, as a brutal and to some extent unnecessary conflict. His close association with it would lessen his stature. But in 1918, it appeared to make him little short of invincible. He can be Prime Minister for life if he likes, said one of his many rivals at the time. But Lloyd George's position was in reality much weaker than it seemed. Lloyd George was at the height of his powers, honoured everywhere, immensely popular, and yet he had one fundamental political problem. His Liberal Party had been split for the past 2 years. The man he'd replaced as Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, had moved off into opposition with his Liberal supporters. And facing them, on the other side of the House, was Lloyd George's wartime coalition, which consisted of his Liberal supporters, most Conservative